Aloha, and welcome to AP Biology with Mr. Hardy. So we're going to dive into some of the more advanced kind of ecological definitions, topics that are a little tougher to understand, hopefully make it easy for you to feel confident in your ecology vocabulary. So let's start by just talking about the difference between an organism's habitat and its niche, okay? And so remember, a habitat is where, all right, and a niche is how, okay? So a habitat represents where an organism lives, feeds, survives, all right? So that would include your habitat components, your food, your water, your shelter, okay? So an organism's living area, okay, food, water, shelter, it just describes where that organism might live, okay? And so a tree might be a habitat for a certain organism. A niche is how that organism survives within its habitat. Okay. And so there might be many organisms that live in the same tree, but they may not be directly competing for the same resource within that tree, or they might be using the tree differently. For instance, you might have a bunch of insects living in the tree. Some of those insects feed on the tree directly. Others of those insects might be predatory, and they feed on the insects that also feed on the tree. And so they would have different niches. One would be an herbivore that's feeding off the tree. One would be a carnivore feeding off of other insects. So for instance, an ant versus a praying mantis. The ant feeding directly off the tree, the praying mantis feeding on the ant. Or aphid and ladybug. The aphid is a parasite on the tree. The ladybug is eating the aphid. Different niches, okay? So these are just two important terms. Now, they bring us to another important set of terms called competitive exclusion and resource partitioning, okay? So these are important terms because in any environment, when you're studying the energy flow and the interactions between the organisms, generally speaking, if two organisms are competing directly for the same resource, one is going to be inherently better at competing, and it's going to exclude or kick out the other organism. In other words, one organism is going to thrive, and the other organism is going to struggle and possibly even go extinct or have to leave that particular community and migrate to another area. So that's what we call competitive exclusion, to compete and to exclude. And so two organisms competing for the same resource is going to mean that one's going to survive best and the other one is going to be excluded and have to find another food source, okay? Whereas resource partitioning, this is when you have nuanced niches. In other words, you have organisms living in the same particular area, but instead of competing directly, they feed at different levels or they feed at different parts of the tree, for instance, so that they don't have to compete directly. And then they can coexist. Great example of this are howler monkeys and spider monkeys down in Central America. So the spider monkeys, they feed on fruits mainly, fruits, nuts, and so forth. And so the spider monkeys will go and they'll find fruits, the budding parts of the different plants, whereas the howler monkeys eat leaves. And so they can live in the same forest within the same trees because the howler monkey is eating the leaves, the spider monkey eating the fruits, and they're not competing directly. They're partitioning the resources so that they can coexist in the same habitat and not compete directly. One doesn't kick the other out. They're not excluding the other. So that's competitive exclusion, resource partitioning. Okay? Resource partitioning then is going to allow for an increase in what we call species richness, which is our next term. So species richness is the idea that should have put it on another page. Richness, species richness is the idea that we can count the number of organisms in the area and give us an idea of how rich or how plentiful the organisms are. So species richness is number of different species found in a particular area. Normally we call that species diversity, but diversity is a little broader. And so species diversity includes species richness as well as what we call relative abundance. And so here, species richness is technically the number of different species in a particular area, whereas species diversity takes into account how many different species there are and how abundant each species is. In other words, I might have 10 different species in an area, but 3 of them are thriving and 7 of them are near extinction. And so that would not be great species diversity. Whereas I might have 8 different species in another environment, but all 8 are abundant. And so we would call the 8 species that are all abundant a more diverse ecosystem than 10 species where 7 of them are threatened or endangered. There's less species diversity because those threatened and endangered species might be having a negative impact on the rest of the environment because there's just not quite as much abundance, and therefore there's a higher chance for there to be struggle in those particular environments. So that's the difference between species richness and species diversity. Okay? And then finally, our last 2 terms that I had want to hit on is just an understanding of how, when we look at the structures of ecosystems or communities, how there are foundational species and keystone species. Oh, not spelling well today. Okay. Difference here, a foundational species is an abundant source for other organisms usually to feed on and so forth. So foundational species are a highly abundant species that is foundational to the ecosystem. Oftentimes that's going to be a producer, and an abundant producer is going to create the opportunity for a lot of species richness because many different organisms can feed on directly or can feed on organisms that feed directly on that producer. So foundational species are an abundant species that have a big impact on the environment because of its abundance. A keystone species might be a much less abundant species, but has a major impact, okay, on the other species in the environment despite its lack of abundance. A great example of this are often predators, top-level consumers, and their influence on many different organisms. Quick story. So in Yellowstone National Park and in the Midwest of the United States, we did our best to exterminate wolves. So right around the turn of the century, turn of the 18th to 19th centuries, we went through 1800s to 1900s, and we did our best to exterminate wolves. We had cattle ranchers and other livestock ranchers that wanted to get rid of the wolves so that they didn't have a predator eating their sheep or their cows and so forth. In addition, we had hunters that wanted to hunt prey like elk and deer, antelope, and they figured by getting rid of the wolves, there'd be a much more abundant elk, deer, and antelope to eat. The problem is without those wolves, you had deer populations that would fluctuate wildly. They would propagate and grow out of control, and then they would wipe out their food source, and they would have a mass starvation event, and then they would grow and grow and grow, and then they'd wipe out again. In addition, what we found in Yellowstone is we studied the park over 80 years. And without wolves, we saw elk populations and antelope populations grow, but we also saw that aspen groves and other producers getting overgrazed and overeaten and really, really struggling. Well, we reintroduced wolves back into Yellowstone in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And when we reintroduced the wolves, we did a great ecological study of how the wolves impacted the entire ecosystem. And we see all of these herbivore populations growing and remaining steady. They're not shrinking because of the wolves, but actually remaining fairly steady. But also we see an abundance of growth in the aspen groves and the other producer populations. And so we found that the wolves are an important keystone species. You don't need a lot of wolves in order for their impact to be very prevalent in the whole ecosystem. They have a huge impact on the rest of the species because of their ability to control prey and therefore steady and stabilize many populations within the ecosystem. So foundational species is abundant and it's necessary. Keystone species is not abundant, but equally necessary, has a major impact on the environment despite their lack of abundance.